The rope lay coiled on Horace Talbot's desk, like a sleeping snake, its fibers still carrying the weight of 3 men who'd sworn the same oath he had. Outside his study window, August thunder rolled across Meriwether County, Georgia, promising a storm that wouldn't break the heat. It was 1876, and the Grand Master of the White Brotherhood kept meticulous records. Meeting minutes, membership rolls, punishment schedules, all locked in a cabinet whose key never left his vest pocket. What he didn't record was the sound his boots made climbing the barn ladder that night, or the way lantern light caught his daughter's face when she realized he'd been standing in the hayloft doorway for a full 30 seconds before either of them noticed. Everyone who heard about it later expected Josiah to die screaming. Instead, Horace smiled, said 4 words that made his daughter's blood stop, and walked back to the house to fetch the good rope, the one he saved for special occasions. Meriwether County sat in the western belt of Georgia where cotton still ruled, and Reconstruction had left scars deeper than Sherman's march. The soil was red clay that stained everything it touched, and the Talbot plantation sprawled across 800 acres of it, worked by 42 people who owned nothing, not even their own names in the county ledger. Horace Talbot had inherited the land from his father in 1869, along with a reverence for bloodlines that bordered on religious mania and a certainty that the war had ended wrong. The main house was Greek Revival, white columns peeling paint in the humidity, surrounded by magnolias that bloomed with a sweetness that couldn't quite cover the smell of the tannery half a mile downwind. Horace had added a 3rd-floor cupola in 1872, ostensibly for observing the fields, but actually for watching the road from town. A man in his position needed to see visitors coming. His wife, Margaret, had died of fever in 1874, leaving him with 1 child, Lily, 17 years old in the summer of 1876, with her mother's dark hair and a disposition Horace alternately praised as refined and cursed as willful, depending on whether she was obeying him. He kept her on a schedule tighter than any field hand's. Morning prayers, French lessons with a widow from Atlanta who came Tuesdays and Thursdays, needlework in the afternoon, supper at 6 sharp, bed by 9. She was permitted to walk the garden unaccompanied only between 3 and 4 in the afternoon, and only if she wore gloves and a hat. At Brotherhood meetings, Horace spoke of white womanhood as civilization's crown jewel, a vessel too precious for contamination. His own daughter was Exhibit 1 in this theology. Men rode 20 miles to see Lily Talbot presiding over the refreshment table at recruitment rallies, her posture perfect, her smile controlled, her silence interpreted as modesty. They didn't know she'd taught herself to read Latin from her grandfather's books, or that she'd memorized the location of every loose floorboard in the house so she could move without sound after Horace went to sleep. The White Brotherhood wasn't the Klan, technically. It had reorganized under that name in 1874 after federal marshals made the old fraternity too dangerous. But it kept the same rituals, the same roster, the same night rides. Horace had risen to Grand Master by 1875 through a combination of family reputation and tactical brutality. He never participated in the violence directly. He planned it. He knew which judges would look away, which sheriffs needed bribes, which newspapers would print the Brotherhood's version of events. He kept files on every member, insurance against betrayal. Tuesday meetings happened in the barn behind the house. 20 to 30 men in makeshift hoods, oil lamps casting shadows that danced like demons on the walls. They discussed threats, a freedman who'd registered to vote, a northern teacher who'd opened a school, a merchant who'd sold goods to black customers on credit. Horace assigned tasks the way a general deployed troops. 3 men here, 5 men there, always with alibis prearranged. Punishment was called correction. Murder was called justice. Josiah had belonged to the plantation since before the war, born there in 1848, which made him 28 in 1876. His mother had died when he was 12. His father had been sold to a textile mill in Alabama when Josiah was 15 and never heard from again. After emancipation, he'd tried walking to Savannah to find work, made it as far as Thomaston before a patrol picked him up for vagrancy and returned him to Horace's father, who'd promptly hired him as a field hand for wages that were theoretical. Room and board counted against his labor. Tools were rented at inflated rates. And by the end of each year, Josiah somehow owed more than he'd earned. When Horace inherited the property, he'd moved Josiah to the stables. The young man had a gift with horses, a patience that could calm even the meanest stallion, and Horace needed someone who could maintain the breeding stock. It was the first time in Josiah's life that his skill had earned him something approximating respect, even if that respect was conditional and could evaporate at the first sign of what white folks called impudence. What happened between Lily and Josiah started small and accidentally. In April of 1875, Lily had been riding her mare along the eastern property line when the animal spooked at a cottonmouth coiled on the path. The mare reared, Lily lost her seat, and she would have cracked her skull on a limestone outcrop if Josiah hadn't been walking the fence line at that exact moment and caught her as she fell. He'd set her on her feet, asked if she was hurt, and retrieved the mare before it could bolt. Lily had thanked him, actually said the words, "Thank you," looking him in the eye. And Josiah had felt something shift in his chest that he knew was dangerous. They didn't speak again for 2 months, but Lily started riding the eastern line more frequently, and Josiah found reasons to inspect those fences during her designated riding hour. The first real conversation happened in June, Lily asking what he fed the horses to keep their coats so glossy, Josiah explaining the mixture of oats and molasses while carefully not looking at her directly. The second conversation was about books. Lily asked if he could read, and when he said he'd learned a little before the war from the preacher's wife, she offered to lend him her grandfather's copy of Plutarch. That should have been the end of it. Lending a book could be explained away as charity, Christian benevolence toward the less fortunate. But Lily kept bringing books, and Josiah started leaving notes in the margins, careful pencil marks, easily erased, pointing out passages he found meaningful. By August, they were meeting deliberately, Lily walking to the stables during her afternoon garden hour, Josiah having saddled her horse as an excuse for why he was there. They talked about everything except the obvious, that every conversation was a crime in Horace's eyes, that discovery meant death, that the feeling building between them had no future in a county where a black man could be lynched for looking at a white woman too long. The first time they kissed was in September of 1875, in the tack room that smelled of leather oil and hay dust. Lily trembling so hard, Josiah thought she might faint. She'd grabbed his shirt collar and pulled him down to her height and pressed her mouth to his with a desperation that spoke to years of containment. When they broke apart, she'd whispered, "We have to leave here. We have to go north." And Josiah, who'd spent 28 years learning to swallow hope before it could choke him, heard himself say, "I know." Planning an escape in 1876 required more than courage. It required papers, money, and a route that avoided patrollers, Brotherhood sympathizers, and counties where black travelers were arrested on sight. Lily had access to her mother's jewelry, small pieces she could sell without Horace noticing immediately. Josiah had $53 saved from tips he'd earned shoeing horses for neighboring plantations. Wages Horace didn't know about because they'd been paid directly to Josiah, in violation of the arrangement that all his income flow through the main house. The papers were harder. A free black man traveling alone needed documentation, proving he wasn't a runaway laborer breaking contract. A white woman traveling with a black man needed a story that wouldn't get them both killed. Lily proposed they travel as mistress and servant. She'd pose as a widow relocating to Pennsylvania, Josiah as her driver. It was plausible if they could get the paperwork right. Josiah knew a man in Griffin, 20 miles east, who'd been a Union quartermaster during the war and now ran a print shop that did legitimate business and other work for the right price. His name was Clarence Webb, and in November of 1875, Josiah walked to Griffin on his one day off, carrying a letter from Lily that explained what they needed and offered Margaret's pearl brooch as payment. Webb studied the letter, studied Josiah, and asked one question. "You know what happens if these papers fail?" Josiah said, "We know." Webb nodded and said he'd have everything ready by March. 2 sets of documents, one identifying Josiah as a freedman born in Philadelphia and employed by the widow Lily Calhoun, the other identifying Lily as the daughter of a deceased Charleston merchant. The brooch would cover the work, but Webb wanted one more thing, a promise that if they made it north, they'd send word through the Methodist Relief Society so he'd know his work hadn't gotten them killed. Through the winter of 1875 into 1876, Lily and Josiah refined their plan. They'd leave on a Tuesday night when Horace held his Brotherhood meeting. He'd be occupied from 9 until midnight, giving them a 3-hour head start before anyone noticed Lily's absence. They'd take Josiah's horse, ride through the night to Griffin, collect the papers from Webb, then board the train to Atlanta, and from there travel north by rail through Tennessee and Virginia to Pennsylvania. The hayloft became their command center and their sanctuary. Josiah had cleaned it out the previous summer, turning it into a storage area for tack that was rarely used. It was accessed by a ladder only he climbed, and it had a narrow window that looked toward the main house, giving them warning if anyone approached. They met there twice a week after dark, Lily slipping out through the kitchen door that Horace never locked because he couldn't imagine his daughter defying him, Josiah waiting with a blanket and whatever food he'd saved from supper. They talked through scenarios. What if Webb's papers were questioned at the station? They'd say they'd purchased their tickets through an agent and appeal to the station master's sympathy. A grieving widow deserved courtesy. What if someone who knew Horace saw them? They'd be traveling under different names, and Lily would alter her appearance, dye her hair darker, adopt her mother's maiden name accent, wear mourning clothes that discouraged conversation. What if Horace sent men after them? They'd switch trains in Chattanooga, maybe travel west to St. Louis before turning north, covering their trail. The talks became confessions. Lily described the suffocation of her life, the way Horace watched her like she was livestock, whose value depended on unblemished packaging, the nausea she felt sitting at Brotherhood rallies while men praised her father for keeping their county pure. Josiah described the paralysis of contract labor, working every day for wages that evaporated into debt, living in a cabin that legally wasn't his, eating food he'd technically bought on credit, watching children younger than him learn to swallow rage so efficiently they forgot they'd ever been angry. What they didn't talk about at first was what would happen if they were caught. But on a February night in 1876, with sleet tapping against the hayloft roof, Lily said, "He'll kill you. You know that." And Josiah, adjusting the blanket around her shoulders, said, "He'll do worse to you. Lock you away somewhere. Tell people you've gone mad." Maybe marry you off to one of his Brotherhood friends who won't ask questions about damaged goods. Then we don't get caught, Lily said. No, Josiah agreed. We don't. By late July of 1876, they had everything in place. Webb had sent word through a field hand who traveled to Griffin regularly that the papers were ready. Lily had sold 3 pieces of jewelry through a dealer in Columbus who didn't ask whose they were, netting $82. Josiah had arranged for a friend in Griffin to stable the horse until they could send for it later. They'd set the date, Tuesday, August 15th, the night of the regular Brotherhood meeting. They allowed themselves to imagine the future. Josiah would find work in Philadelphia, maybe at a stable, maybe at the docks. Lily would teach. There were schools up north that hired women, schools that served black children who needed educators. They'd marry legally, something Georgia would never permit. They'd have a life that belonged to them. On the night of August 8th, 1 week before their planned departure, Lily came to the hayloft carrying a bottle of wine she'd taken from Horace's study. "I want one thing that's ours before we leave," she said. "One night where we don't just plan, we exist." They drank the wine, and Josiah played a song on the harmonica he'd kept hidden since childhood, a tune his mother used to hum. They talked about the ocean, which neither of them had seen but both wanted to visit. They kissed until kissing wasn't enough, and in the close heat of the hayloft, with August thunder rumbling in the distance, they claimed the future they'd been promised their bodies would never share. What they didn't know was that Horace had canceled that Tuesday's meeting. 3 members had been arrested in Columbus for a night ride that went wrong, and the Grand Master needed to assess whether any of them would talk. He'd spent the evening in his study reviewing membership files, burning documents that might link him to the arrested men, and drinking bourbon to steady his nerves. Around 11, he'd decided to check the grounds, a habit from the war, when Yankee scouts could appear at any hour. He'd seen lamplight in the hayloft window. Horace stood at the base of the ladder for a full minute, listening to the sounds from above, his face expressionless. Then he climbed, moving quietly despite his size, and when he reached the top, he stood in the open frame of the loft entrance and simply watched. Lily saw him first. She made a sound like a wounded animal scrambling for her dress. Josiah turned, saw Horace's silhouette against the lamplight, and understood in that instant that everything they'd planned had just collapsed into ash. Horace didn't shout. He didn't rush forward. He smiled, a cold, controlled expression that reached his eyes only as calculation, and said, "Don't move yet. I want to remember this exactly." Then he descended the ladder, walked to the house, and returned 15 minutes later with 4 men who'd been drinking at his table: his overseer, his banker, the county sheriff, and his brother-in-law. All of them Brotherhood, all of them complicit by design. The cellar beneath the main house had been dug in 1852, supposedly for storing preserves and root vegetables. But Horace's father had used it for something else during the war, a holding area for captured deserters and the occasional runaway, a place where men could be questioned without neighbors hearing. Horace had maintained the space, adding shackles to the wall and a drain in the center of the floor. It smelled of mildew and old fear, and the only light came from whatever lantern you carried down the narrow stairs. They dragged Lily and Josiah there separately. Lily fought, screaming until Horace slapped her hard enough to split her lip, then sobbing until she ran out of breath. Josiah went quietly, knowing that resistance would only make the men more eager for violence, calculating even in his terror that quiet compliance might buy seconds to think. Horace chained Josiah to the wall, hands above his head, then turned to Lily, who stood between the sheriff and the banker, both men holding her arms. "You're going to tell me everything," Horace said, his voice steady as a deposition. "How long this has been happening, whose idea it was, whether anyone helped you plan it." Lily met her father's eyes and said, "Go to hell." Horace hit her again. Then he turned to his overseer, a man named Pike who'd worked the plantation for 12 years and had a reputation for creative cruelty. "Not him," Horace said, nodding toward Josiah. "Not yet. I want him undamaged for what comes next." Pike looked disappointed but nodded. "What comes next?" Horace continued, addressing the room but watching his daughter. "Requires a story, and Lily is going to give us that story, or I'm going to have Dr. Hendricks declare her unfit, and she'll spend the rest of her days in the asylum at Milledgeville, eating porridge and sleeping in her own filth." The asylum threat wasn't new. Horace had invoked it twice before when Lily had defied him on smaller matters. But this time the men in the room nodded their agreement. Women who behaved as Lily had behaved could be declared insane under Georgia law. A father's testimony carried weight. The process was simple. "Here's the story," Horace said. "Josiah assaulted you. He forced himself on you. You fought him, but he overpowered you. You're a victim, Lily. An innocent victim of a criminal who took advantage of your Christian charity." He paused. "Say it." Lily said nothing. Blood ran from her split lip onto her dress. Horace nodded to Pike, who stepped toward Josiah and pulled a knife from his belt. "Not to use, just to show. Just to establish the grammar of the situation." "I can make him scream for hours," Pike said conversationally. "I can make him beg you to save him. I can make you watch every second of it." He looked at Horace. "Or we can skip that part if the lady cooperates." What happened next depended on who told the story later. The sheriff, in his official report, said Lily broke down immediately and confessed through sobs that Josiah had threatened her into compliance over many weeks, and that she'd been too frightened to tell anyone. The banker, in private conversation, said Lily had stared at Josiah for a long minute before speaking, as if asking permission, and Josiah had given the smallest nod. What the records don't capture is the look that passed between Lily and Josiah in that cellar, the entire conversation they had without words. She was asking if there was another way. He was answering that there wasn't, not one that kept them both alive tonight. He was telling her to do what Horace demanded, to buy time, to survive this moment even if it meant breaking everything they'd built together. Lily turned to her father and said, in a voice scraped raw, "He forced me. He told me he'd burn the house down if I told anyone. He said he'd kill me." Horace's expression didn't change. "When did it start?" 2 months ago, June." "Where?" "The stables, then the hayloft." "Did anyone help him?" "No. He worked alone." Horace looked at Josiah. "Do you confess to assaulting my daughter?" Josiah understood the trap. Denial meant Pike's knife, meant hours of pain, meant a slow death that accomplished nothing. Confession meant something else. Something Horace had already planned, but hadn't revealed yet. The choice wasn't between truth and lies. It was between which lie would let him see tomorrow. "Yes," Josiah said. The word hung in the cellar like smoke. Horace turned to the sheriff. "You witnessed his confession. Write it up." To Pike. "Get him ready for transport." To his brother-in-law. "Draft a bill of sale, I'm selling him tonight." Lily's head snapped up. "What?" "I said I'm selling him." Horace's voice was pleasant, almost gentle. "To a buyer in Alabama who specializes in difficult cases. He'll work the rest of his life in a turpentine camp, chained at night, under guard during the day. It's a mercy, really. The Brotherhood wanted him hanged, but I convinced them a living example is more instructive. You can't. I already did. The buyer's in town waiting for the paperwork. He'll have Josiah on a wagon by dawn. Horace smiled. You'll never see him again, Lily. He'll never see you. And in 6 months, when the scandal dies down, I'll marry you to Judge Hammond's son, and you'll give me grandchildren who carry proper blood. Lily's legs gave out. The sheriff caught her before she hit the floor. Horace addressed Josiah directly for the first time. You thought you could take something from me. You thought I wouldn't notice. But men like you always underestimate men like me. He leaned closer. 18 years you'll work those pines, boy. 18 years breathing turpentine fumes that'll rot your lungs, sleeping in mud, eating rancid meal. And every single day you'll remember the girl you touched, and you'll know she's lying in a proper bed with a proper husband, living the life you tried to steal. He turned and climbed the stairs, leaving Pike and the sheriff to finish the work. The wagon left at 4:30 in the morning. August 9th, 1876, Josiah shackled in the back with 2 other men being transported to different fates. The driver was a thick man who chewed tobacco and didn't speak except to curse the horses. They traveled east toward Atlanta, the road rutted and jarring, sunlight breaking through pine trees in shafts that hurt to look at. Josiah had been whipped once before they loaded him, 10 lashes across his back, delivered by Pike with efficient brutality, enough to mark him, but not so many he'd die in transit. The pain was bright and constant, but what consumed him wasn't physical. It was the memory of Lily's face in the cellar, the way she'd looked at him before saying the words Horace demanded, the question in her eyes and the answer he'd given. He'd told her to survive. He hoped she understood that survival was the only gift he could give her. They stopped at noon near a creek to water the horses. The driver unchained the 3 prisoners so they could relieve themselves, warning them that he had a shotgun and knew how to use it. Josiah knelt by the water, splashing his face, when the driver said, "You the Talbot situation?" Josiah nodded. "Thought so. You're getting off at the next town." The driver spat tobacco juice into the grass. "Other buyers waiting there. Man named Webb. Said you'd know him." Josiah's head came up fast. Webb. Clarence Webb from Griffin. The forger. "He paid off your transport fee 3 weeks ago," the driver continued, "plus a little extra to make sure the paperwork got confused. Far as the county knows, you're on your way to Alabama. Far as I know, you're getting sold to a private buyer in Tennessee who needed a groom. Horace Talbot's gonna get a receipt and a confirmation letter in 6 weeks, saying you arrived safe at the Turpentine camp. By then you'll be wherever Webb's sending you." Josiah's mind raced. Why would he do that? Didn't say. Just paid me, gave me instructions, and told me to keep my mouth shut. The driver shrugged. "I don't ask questions when the money's good. We're 3 hours from Griffin. You'll be off my wagon by dark, and I'll have forgotten I ever saw you." The rest of the ride passed in a blur. Josiah's back throbbed. His wrists were raw from the shackles. But hope, that dangerous, treacherous thing, started unfurling in his chest. Webb had gotten him out. Somehow, Webb had known what would happen and prepared for it, which meant someone had told Webb, which meant Lily had found a way to communicate with him even from inside Horace's house. They reached Griffin just after 5. The driver pulled the wagon behind Webb's print shop, unchained Josiah, and handed him off to Webb without ceremony. Webb paid the driver, watched him leave, then turned to Josiah and said, "She sent word through a housemaid whose brother works for me. Said if anything went wrong, I was to buy you out and hold you here. She said you'd understand what that means." "What does it mean?" Josiah asked. "It means she's not done," Webb said. "It means you need to heal, get strong, and wait for her signal. Because whatever she's planning, she needs you alive and free to help her do it." Webb took Josiah into the back room of the print shop, which doubled as a photography studio and an infirmary for people who couldn't go to white doctors. He cleaned Josiah's back, applied a salve that stung like hellfire, and wrapped the wounds in clean cloth. Then he showed Josiah to a small room above the shop that contained a cot, a wash basin, and a window overlooking the street. "You'll stay here until further notice," Webb said. "I'll bring food, and you'll work in the shop doing typesetting once you're healed. If anyone asks, you're my cousin from Charleston, working for room and board while you learn the trade. Your name is Samuel Hayes." "What about Lily?" "What about her? She's in her father's house, under watch, probably being fitted for a wedding dress." Webb's voice was flat. "You can't contact her. You can't go near that plantation. If Horace finds out you're not in Alabama, he'll send men to finish what he started, and I'll lose my shop, and probably my life for harboring you. So I just wait?" "You wait, you heal, and you trust that she knows what she's doing." Webb pulled a folded letter from his pocket. "She sent this. Said to give it to you once you were safe." Josiah unfolded the paper with shaking hands. Lily's handwriting, small and precise. "If you're reading this," Webb succeeded. "Stay where he tells you. Do what he tells you. I need 6 months to position everything. Trust me, I haven't broken. I've just bent in a direction Father doesn't expect. When it's time, you'll know. Wait for the signal. I love you." El Josiah read the letter 3 times, then burned it in the wash basin as Webb had instructed. He lay on the cot and stared at the ceiling and tried to understand what Lily meant by positioning everything. It would be 4 months before he found out. Lily returned to her scheduled life with a precision that unnerved everyone who watched her. The morning after Josiah's sale, she appeared at breakfast dressed in morning gray, her split lip covered with powder, her hands folded in her lap. She ate a soft-boiled egg, drank her tea, and when Horace asked how she felt, she said, "Grateful that you acted decisively to protect me, Father." Horace studied her face for deception and found none. She looked like a woman who'd been broken and was now trying to rebuild herself within acceptable parameters, which was exactly what he wanted to see. Over the following weeks, Lily became the model daughter Horace had always demanded. She attended church without complaint, sat through brotherhood gatherings with a fixed smile, and when Judge Hammond's son, a 29-year-old lawyer named Peter, came to dinner in September, she conversed politely about literature and music and asked appropriate questions about his career. Peter was bland but harmless, the kind of man who'd accept a wife with a scandalous past if her dowry was sufficient and her father's influence useful. What no one saw was Lily's real work, which happened in margins and shadows. She'd always had access to Horace's study. He'd trained her to organize his correspondence, file his legal documents, and maintain his appointment calendar as part of her education in household management. Now she used that access surgically. She memorized the names in his membership roster, noting who attended meetings regularly and who'd missed the last 3. She read through minutes from the past year, tracking which members had been assigned to which corrections and whether any had expressed reluctance. She found letters discussing brotherhood business, coordination with chapters in neighboring counties, plans for intimidating black voters before the November election, complaints about members who'd grown squeamish about night riding. Most importantly, she found Horace's insurance files, the leverage he kept on every member. One man was embezzling from his church. Another had a mistress in Atlanta. A third had been involved in a fraud scheme that could send him to prison if the right prosecutor learned about it. Horace documented everything, not because he planned to use it, but because power came from knowing you could. Lily began making copies, not full transcripts. That would take too long and risk discovery, but careful notes written in her own shorthand, small enough to hide in the seam of her mattress. Names, dates, locations, crimes. She was building a map of the Brotherhood's nervous system, identifying which arteries to cut. The housemaid who'd carried Lily's message to Webb was named Rose, 42 years old, who'd worked at the plantation since before the war. Rose had a son who'd been sold south in 1873 for reading a newspaper aloud to other workers, and she'd spent 3 years looking for any way to hurt the men who'd taken him. When Lily approached her in September with a proposal, Rose listened. "I need you to carry letters," Lily said. They were in the kitchen, late afternoon, alone except for the flies buzzing against the window screen. "To people in town, to people in other counties. Father can't know. If he finds out, we're both dead." Rose looked at this girl who'd grown up in the big house, who'd never missed a meal or worn the same dress twice, and said, "Why would I help you?" "Because I'm going to destroy the men who took your son, all of them, starting with my father." Lily's voice didn't waver. "I can't do it alone. I need someone who can move without being watched, someone they underestimate." Rose considered. "What's in it for me? I can't bring your son back, but I can make sure the people who sold him pay for it. And when this is over, if we survive, I'll deed you the land where your cabin sits, free and clear." It was a wild promise from someone with no legal standing, but Rose heard the truth beneath it. This girl had nothing left to lose and everything to burn down. That made her more reliable than any contract. "What do you need me to do?" Rose asked. The first letter went to Clarence Webb in Griffin, confirming that Josiah was safe and asking Webb to send a reply through Rose's brother. Lily needed to know Josiah was alive, was healing, was still willing to help when the time came. Webb's reply arrived 2 weeks later. "He's here. He's strong. He's waiting." The second letter went to a Union veteran named Marcus DeWitt, who lived in Columbus and ran a network helping black families escape violent counties. Lily had found his name in one of Horace's files. The Brotherhood had been planning to run him out of town, but hadn't acted yet because DeWitt had friends in the U.S. Marshal's office. She wrote to him using her mother's maiden name, explained her situation in careful language that didn't incriminate her on paper, and asked if he could provide certain resources, forged documents, safe houses, and access to people who knew how to disappear someone permanently. DeWitt's reply came in October. "Your father's men killed a friend of mine last spring. I'll help you on one condition. When you take him down, do it in a way that exposes the whole operation. I want evidence that goes beyond one chapter. I want their names in newspapers. I want federal indictments." Lily wrote back, "You'll have it." The third letter went to a journalist in Atlanta named Sarah Holcomb, who'd been writing about Klan violence for Northern papers under a pseudonym. Lily had read her work in copies of the New York Tribune that her French tutor smuggled in, and she knew Holcomb was hungry for a story big enough to force federal intervention. Lily wrote, "I have records, membership lists, meeting minutes, correspondence with other chapters. I can give you everything, but I need time to make sure the people I care about are safe first. Can you wait 6 months?" Holcomb's reply, I'll wait a year if the story's as good as you say. But you need to understand, publishing this will put a target on your back. The Brotherhood will know you betrayed them. You'll need protection, probably relocation. Are you prepared for that? Lily wrote back, I'm prepared. By November, Lily had established a communication network that ran through Rose, Webb, DeWitt, and Holcomb. She had a plan forming in her mind, though she hadn't shared all of it yet. The Brotherhood met every Tuesday. Horace kept his schedule consistent. Home by midnight, bourbon in the study until 1, asleep by 2. That gave Lily a 3-hour window every week to work in his study, copying documents, refining her map of vulnerabilities. Peter Hammond proposed in December, presenting a ruby ring that had belonged to his grandmother. Lily accepted with a smile that looked genuine to everyone except Rose, who saw the girl's hands shaking when she returned to the kitchen afterward. When? Rose asked. June, Lily said. The wedding's set for June 22nd. We have 6 months. 6 months to position everything. 6 months to make sure every piece was in place before she burned her father's world down and walked through the ashes toward whatever life waited on the other side. Samuel Pike, Horace's overseer, drowned in January of 1877 in the creek that ran along the plantation's southern boundary. The official story was that he'd been checking fences during a cold rain, slipped on wet rocks, hit his head, and gone under before he could recover. His body was found the next morning by field hands who'd heard his horse running loose. The sheriff investigated because Pike was a Brotherhood member, and his death was sudden, but the evidence supported an accident. The rocks were slick with moss. The water was high from winter rains, and there was a visible wound on Pike's skull consistent with a fall. No witnesses, no signs of struggle, no reason to suspect foul play. The coroner ruled accidental death. What the records don't show is that Pike had been drinking that afternoon. Not unusual for him, but enough to slow his reflexes, and that someone had loosened a section of fence earlier that day, so his horse would notice and he'd go investigate. Or that the rock Pike slipped on had been deliberately placed in the water the night before, positioned exactly where a man stepping off the bank would put his foot. Or that when Pike went under, stunned but not unconscious, someone held him down for the 40 seconds it took for his lungs to fill. Rose heard about Pike's death from her brother, who heard it from the field hands who found the body. She told Lily at breakfast, her voice carefully neutral, and watched the girl's face show nothing but polite concern. How terrible, Lily said. Father will need to hire a new overseer. That afternoon, Lily walked to the garden as usual, carrying her needlework basket. Inside the basket, hidden beneath embroidery thread, was a letter she'd written the night before. Rose collected it from the hollow tree near the fence line where they left their exchanges, and by evening, the letter was on its way to Griffin. Webb received it, read it, and delivered it to Josiah, who was living under the name Samuel Hayes and working as a typesetter in the print shop. The letter said, "The first step is done. Pike won't hurt anyone else. 11 more, then Father. Stay ready." El Josiah read the letter twice before burning it. He'd known Lily was planning something, but he hadn't known she'd already started. Pike's death was no accident. Lily had engineered it, or arranged for someone to engineer it, and made it look natural enough that no investigation would follow. Webb found Josiah sitting on the cot in the back room, staring at his hands. "You all right?" Webb asked. "She killed him," Josiah said, "or had him killed. Pike was a monster. You know what he did to people." "I know, but she's..." Josiah struggled for words. "She's becoming something I don't recognize." She's becoming what she needs to be to survive, Webb said. You can judge her for it, or you can help her finish what she started. But you don't get to do both. The second death came in March. Judge Thaddeus Lyle, a Brotherhood member who'd signed off on 3 lynchings in the past 2 years, died when his carriage overturned on the road between Greenville and Woodbury. The axle had snapped, sending the judge and his driver into a ravine. The driver survived with broken ribs. The judge broke his neck. Investigators found the axle had been partially sawed through. Not enough to fail immediately, but enough that rough terrain would finish the job. The crime was attributed to robbery, though nothing had been stolen, and the sheriff speculated that the perpetrator had been scared off before completing the theft. In April, a lawyer named Edmund Cross, Brotherhood treasurer, who kept the chapter's financial records in a safe in his office, died of what appeared to be a heart attack while working late. His clerk found him slumped over his desk the next morning. The coroner noted that Cross was 53, overweight, and had complained of chest pains for months, making the death unremarkable. What the coroner didn't note was that Cross's evening brandy had contained a tincture of foxglove, carefully measured to mimic cardiac arrest, administered by someone who had access to his office and knowledge of poisons. 3 deaths in 4 months. The Brotherhood started to notice. The April meeting began with prayer and ended with paranoia. Horace stood at the front of the barn. Pike's replacement, a man named Garrett, had tried to clean the space, but the smell of hay and horse manure was permanent, and addressed the 27 members present. "Brothers," he said, his voice carrying the authority that had made him Grand Master, "we're facing a threat. 3 of our number are dead. The official explanations are plausible, but the pattern suggests coordination." Murmur ran through the group. Daniel Frost, who owned the bank in town, spoke up. "You think it's the freedmen? Organized retaliation?" "I think it's someone who knows us," Horace said. "Who knows our schedules, our habits, our vulnerabilities. The accidents are too convenient. Pike drowns when he's alone. Lyle's axle fails on a deserted road. Cross dies in his office at night with no witnesses." He paused. "Someone is hunting us." Silence. Then Sheriff Vance, a heavy-set man with a mustache that drooped to his jawline, asked, "What about the girl? Your Lily. Could she—" "Lily is preparing for her wedding," Horace interrupted, his voice sharp. "She has no knowledge of our operations beyond what she overhears at dinner. She's been under my watch since the incident last summer, and I've seen no evidence of disloyalty." But even as he said it, Horace felt the first tickle of doubt. Lily had been too compliant lately, too perfect. Women who'd been traumatized usually showed symptoms: nightmares, tears, withdrawal. Lily showed none of that. She functioned like a piece of well-maintained machinery, which was either a sign of extraordinary resilience or extraordinary acting. After the meeting, Horace went to his study and reviewed the past 6 months. Pike's death in January, Lyle in March, Cross in April. 3 men, 3 accidents, 3 Brotherhood members. If it was assassination, the killer had access to information about their movements and meetings, which meant someone inside the chapter was talking, or someone close to a member was gathering intelligence. He pulled out his files and began cross-referencing. Who'd been present at the last meeting each man attended? Who'd had contact with them in the week before their deaths? Who might have a motive? The answer he kept returning to, the one he didn't want to acknowledge, was that the perfect inside source would be someone living in his house, someone who had access to his study, his correspondence, his schedule, Someone who could observe him without being observed. Someone like Lily. He tested her at dinner the next night, mentioning casually that Sheriff Vance's wife had taken ill and the sheriff might need to step back from his duties. It was a lie. Vance's wife was fine. But Horace wanted to see if the information leaked. If Lily was the source, she'd find a way to pass it along, and Horace would catch whoever received the message. 3 days later, Vance reported that nothing had happened. No one had approached him asking about his wife's health. No suspicious inquiries at the doctor's office. The information had gone nowhere, which meant either Lily wasn't the leak or she'd recognized the test and avoided it. Horace decided on a different approach. He began locking his study at night, pocketing the key. He started varying his schedule, coming home earlier some nights, later others, skipping patterns that could be anticipated. He assigned Garrett to watch the house after dark, noting who came and went. Garrett reported that Rose, the housemaid, took an unusually long time on her errands to town, often stopping to talk with her brother near the livery stable. Horace filed that information away, but didn't act on it yet. If he arrested Rose without evidence, it would alert whoever she was working with. Better to watch, to wait, to gather proof. What Horace didn't realize was that Lily had anticipated his suspicion. She'd stopped using Rose for communication in March, switching to a new courier, a laundress named Helen who worked for 3 different households and whose movements were too routine to draw attention. The letters to Webb, DeWitt, and Holcomb now traveled hidden in bundles of clean linens, passed from Helen to a contact at the train station, shipped as part of a legitimate delivery service. By May, the network had adapted. Lily was still gathering information, still copying documents, still refining the map of the Brotherhood's operations. But she'd gone deeper underground, communicating less frequently and in shorter bursts, making herself harder to trace. And in Griffin, Josiah was learning a different set of skills. Webb had introduced him to Marcus DeWitt during a trip to Columbus in April, and DeWitt had taken one look at Josiah and said, "You're going to be my eyes and ears in clan territory. But first, you need training." What DeWitt meant was, Josiah needed to learn how to kill people without leaving evidence. DeWitt had served with a Union regiment that specialized in sabotage during the war, destroying bridges, poisoning wells, assassinating Confederate officers in ways that looked like accidents. He'd brought those skills into his post-war work, using them to protect black families from night riders. Now he taught Josiah the same methods: how to weaken a fence so a horse would bolt, how to doctor a drink so death looked natural, how to approach a man from behind and ensure he never made a sound. "I'm not asking you to become a murderer," DeWitt said. They were in a barn outside Columbus, practicing with straw dummies. "I'm asking you to become an executioner. There's a difference. Murderers kill for pleasure or profit. Executioners kill because justice demands it and the law won't deliver." Josiah thought about Pike holding a knife in the cellar, about Lyle signing the order that sent a 14-year-old boy to the gallows for stealing a chicken, about Cross keeping ledgers that documented atrocities in neat columns, as if human suffering could be balanced like an accounting book. "Teach me," Josiah said. The rumor started in May of 1877, whispered in the black sections of 3 counties. A hooded man was killing Klansmen, and he knew things only a member would know: where they met, what they wore, how they signaled each other in public. Some said he was a ghost, a murdered freedman returned for vengeance. Others said he was a white renegade, a former member who'd turned against the Brotherhood. A few said he was a Union spy who'd been embedded since the war, waiting for the right moment to strike. The truth was more complicated and more collaborative. Josiah was the figure they saw, when they saw anyone at all, but he wasn't working alone. Lily fed him intelligence through the courier network: who was attending meetings, who was traveling where and when, who'd been assigned to the next correction. DeWitt provided logistics: safe houses, weapons, transportation, alibis. Webb handled documentation, creating false trails that pointed investigators in every direction except the right one. The fourth death occurred in late May. Daniel Frost, the banker, was found in his office with his throat cut. The safe behind his desk was open, and $300 in cash were missing, making it look like robbery. But Frost had also been the Brotherhood's connection to county officials. He bribed judges, paid off sheriffs, and ensured that grand juries never indicted Klan members. His ledger, which documented every bribe for the past 4 years, disappeared along with the cash. Lily had the ledger. She'd copied it during one of Horace's Tuesday meetings, then arranged for Josiah to stage the robbery so the real theft, information, not money, would go unnoticed. The money was donated to a freedmen's school in Atlanta. The ledger went to Sarah Holcomb in a sealed envelope with instructions not to publish it yet. She'd need corroboration from other sources before going to press. The fifth death was in June, just weeks before Lily's wedding. Marcus Brennan, a farmer who'd participated in night rides and kept a detailed journal of every correction he'd witnessed, died when his barn burned down with him inside. The fire started at 2 a.m, spread too fast for Brennan to escape, and by the time neighbors arrived, the structure was ash. Investigators found accelerant residue but no witnesses. The death was ruled arson by an unknown party, possibly a rival who'd had a dispute with Brennan over land. What investigators didn't find was that Brennan's journal, which he'd kept locked in a trunk in the barn, had been removed 2 hours before the fire started. Josiah had climbed through a back window, picked the lock on the trunk, taken the journal, and left. The fire was set by someone else entirely. DeWitt's associate, a former Union scout named Thomas Gray, who'd lost his wife to Klan violence and had no qualms about delivering the same in return. 5 men dead in 6 months. The Brotherhood was unraveling. Lily's wedding to Peter Hammond was scheduled for June 22, 1877, at First Methodist in Greenville. Invitations had been sent to 130 guests. Margaret's wedding dress had been altered to fit Lily's frame. The reception would be held at the Talbot plantation, with tables set up under the oaks and a band imported from Atlanta. Peter was pleasant about the whole thing in a passive way that made Lily want to scream. He asked her opinion on nothing important and deferred to Horace on everything significant. The marriage would be comfortable, suffocating, and permanent, exactly the cage Horace had designed for her. On June 15th, 1 week before the ceremony, Lily received a letter from Webb via Helen the laundress. Inside was a train ticket to Philadelphia, a set of forged papers identifying her as widow Catherine Mercer, and a note in Josiah's handwriting. Everything is ready. DeWitt has a safe house waiting. Holcomb will publish the story the day after you arrive, using the documents you've provided. We'll get you out during the reception. Rose has arranged for a carriage to be waiting on the East Road at 9 p.m. Father will be occupied with guests until at least 10. That gives us an hour. Trust the plan. I'll be waiting at the station in Griffin. Lily burned the letter and pocketed the ticket. That evening at dinner, she asked Horace if she could take a final ride around the property before the wedding. "I want to say goodbye to the places I've loved," she said. "Once I'm married, Peter will expect me to stay close to his estate." Horace considered. Lily had been perfect for months, Obedient, pleasant, focused on wedding preparations. A final sentimental gesture seemed harmless. "Take Rose with you," he said, "and be back by dark." The next day, Lily rode to the eastern fence line where she and Josiah had first met. She dismounted, tied the mare to a post, and walked to the spot where he'd caught her when she fell. She stood there for 5 minutes, remembering the weight of his hands, the look in his eyes, the moment everything started. Rose, who'd been waiting with the horses, joined her. "You're really leaving," Rose said. "Not a question. I'm really leaving. And if this works, Father will be ruined. The Brotherhood will be exposed. The people who hurt your son and 100 others will face consequences." Lily turned to face her. "But I need you to stay behind. Someone has to maintain the story. Tell people I ran away with a lover, or that I had a breakdown and fled, or whatever lie keeps suspicion off you. Can you do that?" Rose nodded. "What happens to the plantation after he falls?" "It'll be seized or sold. The workers will be free to leave. Actually free, not this sharecropping bondage Horace pretends is fair." Lily pulled a folded deed from her pocket. "This transfers ownership of your cabin and the acre around it to you, free and clear. It's not legal right now because I have no authority, but I've left copies with Webb and DeWitt. When the dust settles, they'll make sure it's filed properly." Rose took the deed, looked at it, then at Lily. "You could have run the night they took Josiah. You could have saved yourself and left us all behind." "I know. Why didn't you?" "Because my father built his power on the idea that some people matter and others don't. I wanted to prove him wrong before I left." Lily smiled, sharp and cold. "And because I needed everyone to see what happens when you underestimate a woman you've spent 17 years training to be obedient." They rode back to the house as the sun set, the sky turning the color of a healing bruise. The wedding reception began at 7 on June 22, 1877, guests arriving in a steady stream of carriages and horses, the Talbot plantation lit with lanterns hung from the oak trees. Tables groaned with food prepared by hired help from Greenville. Horace hadn't trusted the plantation kitchen after Pike's death, though he never said it aloud. A 3-piece band played waltzes while white guests danced and drank punch and congratulated Horace on his daughter's successful match. Lily moved through the evening like an actress who'd perfected her role. She smiled at Judge Hammond, kissed Peter's cheek when prompted, accepted congratulations from women who'd once whispered about her scandal. She wore the altered wedding dress, her mother's pearls, and an expression of serene contentment that would have won awards if anyone had been watching closely enough to see the steel underneath. At 8:45, she excused herself to use the ladies' retiring room inside the house. Rose accompanied her, as propriety demanded. Once inside, they moved quickly. Lily changed into a traveling dress Rose had hidden in the pantry that morning. She removed the pearls, wrapped them in a handkerchief, and tucked them into Rose's hand. "Sell these if you need to, or keep them. Either way, they're yours now." Rose helped her pin her hair up under a hat, transforming her silhouette. "The carriage is on the East Road, half a mile down. Driver knows you're coming. He'll take you to Griffin." "Thank you, Rose, for everything. Just make sure the story you give that journalist burns them all down." Rose's voice was hard. Every last one. Lily slipped out the kitchen door while the band played and the guests danced, and Horace held court near the punch table, basking in the success of his patriarchal authority. She walked through the darkness toward the East Road, moving quickly but not running. Running would draw attention if anyone saw her from a distance. The carriage was waiting where Rose said it would be, driven by a man Lily didn't recognize, but who clearly knew Webb. "Mrs. Mercer?" he asked. Lily nodded, accepting her new name. They rode through the night toward Griffin, reaching the town just after midnight. The train station was lit by a single lamp, and standing under it was Josiah, dressed in a suit that made him look like a northern shopkeeper rather than a field hand. He saw her, and something in his face broke open. Relief, joy, grief, all at once. Lily stepped down from the carriage and walked to him, and they stood 3 feet apart, not touching yet, just looking at each other for the first time in 10 months. "You're here," Josiah said. "I'm here. The plan worked." "Not yet. It works when we're on that train and Father's world is ash behind us." Lily closed the distance and took his hand, and this time no one was watching to punish them for it. "The documents are with Holcomb. She'll publish tomorrow. DeWitt has your testimony about the Brotherhood's operations, including names and dates. Webb has copies of everything Father kept in his files. By the time anyone realizes I'm gone, it'll be too late to stop it." The train arrived at 1:15 in the morning, heading north toward Atlanta and then on to Tennessee. They boarded using their false names: Catherine Mercer and Samuel Hayes, a widow and her driver, traveling to Pittsburgh. The conductor barely glanced at their tickets. By dawn, they were crossing into Tennessee, and behind them in Meriwether County, Horace Talbot was waking up to discover his daughter had vanished and his world was about to end. The Atlanta Constitution published Sarah Holcomb's story on June 23, 1877, under the headline, "Brotherhood of Terror, KKK Chapter in Meriwether County Exposed by Inside Source." The article ran across 4 columns and included names, dates, and excerpts from documents that could only have come from someone with intimate access to Horace Talbot's files. It detailed the chapter's operations, membership lists, meeting schedules, records of corrections that were actually murders, correspondence with other chapters coordinating voter intimidation before the 1876 election. It named 23 men by full name and occupation. It included testimony from Marcus DeWitt's network about specific atrocities, corroborated by the journals and ledgers Lily had stolen, and it attributed the information to a source within the organization who has provided documentation at great personal risk. The story was picked up by northern papers immediately. The New York Tribune ran it on the 24th, the Philadelphia Inquirer on the 25th. By week's end, federal marshals were en route to Meriwether County with arrest warrants. Horace read the article at breakfast on the 23rd, his coffee growing cold as he absorbed the scale of the disaster. Every secret he'd kept, every crime he'd documented for insurance purposes, was now public. The files he'd used to control his members were now weapons against them all, and the source, an inside source with intimate access, could only be one person. He went to Lily's room and found it empty, her wedding dress draped across the bed, her jewelry box open and missing only the pearls. In the armoire, her traveling clothes were gone. On her desk, she'd left a single sheet of paper with a message in her precise handwriting. "Father, by the time you read this, the evidence will be published, and the federal authorities will be on their way. I've spent the past year documenting your crimes because you made the mistake of thinking I was too broken to fight back. I wasn't broken, I was planning. Josiah is alive. We're both free. And every man you called brother will answer for what they've done. You taught me that power comes from controlling information and eliminating threats. I learned the lesson well. Lily Horace sat on Lily's bed holding the letter, feeling something he'd rarely experienced, the cold certainty of defeat. His daughter hadn't just escaped. She'd destroyed him first. She'd turned his own methods against him, used his own documentation as ammunition, and walked away while he was distracted by a wedding that was never going to happen. The Brotherhood tried to rally. An emergency meeting was called for the evening of June 23rd, but only 11 men showed up. The rest had fled the county or were hiding, waiting to see if the federal marshals would actually follow through. Horace addressed the men who remained, his voice steady despite the panic he felt. "We burn everything," he said. "Meeting minutes, membership records, correspondence. Anything that can tie us to the organization gets destroyed tonight. We deny everything in the article. We claim it's fabricated by Northern agitators who want to relitigate the war. We stick together, and we survive this." But Sheriff Vance, who'd been Brotherhood for 12 years, stood up and said, "I'm out. I've got a family, Horace. I'm not going to prison for this." He walked out, and 3 others followed him. By the end of June, the chapter was effectively dissolved. Some members fled to Texas or Arkansas. Others tried to blend back into normal life, hoping the federal authorities wouldn't have enough evidence to prosecute. A few, including Judge Hammond, hired expensive lawyers from Atlanta and prepared to fight the charges in court. Horace was arrested on July 2, 1877, by a federal marshal named Thompson, who'd ridden down from Atlanta with a stack of warrants. The charge was conspiracy to commit murder, backed by the documents Lily had provided and the testimony DeWitt had gathered. Horace was held in the county jail pending trial, his plantation placed under federal receivership, his name destroyed. From his cell, he wrote one letter. Not to a lawyer, not to a remaining Brotherhood ally, but to Lily, addressed to Catherine Mercer, in care of the Philadelphia Post Office, hoping someone would forward it. The letter said, "You were always smarter than I gave you credit for. I taught you to observe, to plan, to control information, and you used those skills to dismantle everything I built. I should be proud, but mostly I'm just tired. I know you won't forgive me for what I did to you and Josiah, and I don't expect you to. But I want you to understand that I acted from conviction, not cruelty. I believed in a world order that required vigilance and sacrifice. You've proven that order was built on lies. I suppose that makes you the victor." Your father, Horace Lilly, never replied. Horace Talbot's trial began in October of 1877 in federal court in Columbus, Georgia. The prosecution was led by a U.S. attorney named William Graves, who'd made his reputation prosecuting Klan cases during Reconstruction. He presented the documentary evidence Lilly had provided, meeting minutes, membership lists, records of attacks, along with testimony from Marcus DeWitt's network about specific crimes. The defense argued that Horace had been misled by subordinates, that he hadn't personally committed violence, that the documents were taken out of context. The jury deliberated for 6 hours and returned a verdict of guilty on 3 counts of conspiracy to commit murder. Judge Harlan sentenced Horace to 12 years in federal prison. He was transferred to a facility in Alabama, where he served 5 years before dying of pneumonia in 1882. He was 53 years old. Of the 23 men named in Holcomb's article, 17 were prosecuted. 8 were convicted and served sentences ranging from 3 to 10 years. 5 were acquitted by sympathetic juries. 4 fled the state and were never apprehended. The White Brotherhood chapter in Meriwether County ceased to exist, though similar organizations would reorganize under different names in the coming decades. Lily and Josiah settled in Philadelphia under their assumed names. Lily found work as a teacher at a school for black children, using her education to serve students the Georgia system would never have taught. Josiah worked at a stable, then saved enough to open his own small freight business. They married legally in 1878, a quiet ceremony with Marcus DeWitt and Clarence Webb as witnesses. They never returned to Georgia, but the cost of their survival was steep and ongoing. Lily suffered nightmares for years, dreams where she was back in the cellar, or where Horace found them in Philadelphia and dragged them home. Josiah carried scars on his back from Pike's whip and deeper scars from the violence he'd committed to protect them both. They'd killed 5 men between them, directly or by arrangement, and those deaths lived in the space between them like ghosts they couldn't acknowledge. In 1881, Lily received a letter from Rose. It arrived via Webb, who'd maintained contact through the network. Rose wrote that the plantation had been sold at auction, the land divided among several buyers, and the workers had dispersed, some to Atlanta, some to cities further north, some to other counties where sharecropping offered slightly better terms. Rose had kept her cabin and the acre around it, just as Lily had promised. She'd planted a garden, raised chickens, and lived quietly. The letter ended. I don't know if what we did was justice or just revenge. Maybe there's no difference when the law won't protect you. But I sleep better knowing Pike and the others are gone. I hope you sleep better too. Lily wrote back. Some nights I do, some nights I don't. But I'm alive and I'm free, and that's more than Father thought I deserved. Thank you for helping me become the person who could fight back. In 1884, Sarah Holcomb published a book about the Meriwether County case, using the story as a lens to examine KKK operations across the South. She changed names and locations to protect Lily and Josiah, but anyone who'd followed the original article could identify the key players. The book sold modestly in the North and was banned in several southern states. Holcomb sent Lily a copy with an inscription. You gave me the story of a lifetime. I hope it was worth what it cost you. Lily never answered that question, even to herself. The legend didn't die with Horace Talbot's conviction. If anything, it grew stronger. In the years following the trial, reports continued to surface across Georgia, Alabama, and Tennessee of a hooded figure who appeared when Klan members gathered, not at official meetings anymore, since federal pressure had driven those deeper underground, but at informal gatherings, night rides, and planned attacks. The figure knew handshakes, passwords, and meeting locations. He moved like he'd been trained in military tactics, and men who threatened black families or planned violence would sometimes turn up dead in ways that looked accidental or self-inflicted. A fall from a horse, a drowning, a barn fire. The authorities investigated, but never found a pattern solid enough to pursue. Some said it was Josiah, that he'd returned to finish the work he'd started. Others said it was Marcus DeWitt, or one of his network, continuing the campaign against organized terror. A few claimed it was multiple people using the same method. Freedmen who'd learned from the Talbot case that systematic documentation and careful planning could dismantle even entrenched power. The truth was more complicated. Josiah did return to the South 3 times between 1878 and 1885, traveling under assumed names, working with DeWitt's network to gather intelligence on resurgent Klan chapters. He didn't kill anyone on those trips. He'd made a promise to Lily that the 5 deaths in 1877 would be the last blood on his hands. But he did provide information that helped other people make decisions about when and how to act. The mythology served a purpose. The hooded figure became a warning. The Klan could be infiltrated, its secrets exposed, its members held accountable. The story kept white terrorists looking over their shoulders, wondering if the black man serving their dinner or shoeing their horse was watching, remembering, planning. In 1888, Clarence Webb died of a stroke in Griffin, leaving behind a print shop that had quietly served the Underground Railroad and the post-war resistance network for over 2 decades. His will included a sealed letter to be delivered to Samuel Hayes, Philadelphia, which contained one final message. The work continues. Others have taken up the tools we used. The Brotherhood tried to rebuild in Talbot County last year. They got as far as their 3rd meeting before someone left evidence of their plans on the sheriff's desk, and 2 members turned up dead. I don't know who's doing it, but someone learned from what you and Lily started. The story isn't over. Josiah showed the letter to Lily, and they sat in their Philadelphia kitchen, now 15 years removed from Meriwether County, trying to decide how they felt about inspiring a legacy of counter-violence that they'd both participated in and tried to leave behind. We opened a door, Lily said finally. We can't control what walks through it after us. Do you regret it? Josiah asked. Any of it? Lily considered. She thought about the nightmares, the weight of 5 deaths, the knowledge that she'd become exactly as calculating and ruthless as her father, even if she'd aimed that ruthlessness at different targets. She thought about Rose's cabin, the freedmen's school where she taught, the fact that she and Josiah had built a life together that Georgia had tried to make impossible. I regret that it was necessary, she said, but I don't regret that we did it. The official account of the Talbot case, as preserved in federal court records and contemporary newspaper archives, is incomplete by design. The prosecution never revealed that Horace's daughter had been the source of the documents. She was referred to only as a confidential informant with access to the defendant's records. Lily's name appears in the trial transcript only once, in a footnote explaining Horace's motive for maintaining such detailed files. The defendant kept extensive records on Brotherhood members as insurance against betrayal, possibly motivated by concerns that family members or household staff might discover and report his activities. Sarah Holcomb's articles never identified Lily either, though journalists who followed the case closely could infer the truth from the level of detail in the leaked documents. Holcomb's book, published 7 years after the trial, includes a chapter titled The Architecture of Betrayal that discusses how oppressive systems sometimes collapse from within when the people they most seek to control learn to use the oppressor's tools against them. She writes, "The source in the Talbot case understood that her father's power came from documentation and mutual complicity. By copying his records and distributing them to parties who could use them, journalists, federal authorities, and the very communities the Brotherhood sought to terrorize, she transformed his insurance policy into evidence of guilt." Marcus DeWitt continued his work helping black families escape violent counties until his death in 1904. His papers, donated to the Freedmen's Bureau archives, contain references to the Philadelphia widow, who'd provided crucial documentation for multiple cases in the late 1870s. Researchers who've studied the papers believe this was Lily, though her true identity was protected even in DeWitt's private correspondence. Josiah and Lily had 3 children, a daughter born in 1879, a son in 1881, and another daughter in 1884. They raised them in Philadelphia, never telling them the full story of how their parents had met or what they'd done to escape Georgia. The children knew only that their mother had fled an abusive situation and that their father had helped her start a new life in the North. Lily died in 1921 at age 62, after a brief illness. Her obituary in the Philadelphia Inquirer identified her as Catherine Mercer Hayes, a retired schoolteacher who'd served the community for over 40 years. It made no mention of Georgia, the White Brotherhood, or a girl who'd learned her father's methods well enough to destroy him. Josiah lived another 12 years, dying in 1933 at age 85. He'd outlived most of the people who could have connected him to the events in Meriwether County, and his children never learned that the quiet man who ran a freight business had once been hunted across state lines and had helped dismantle a terrorist organization through careful violence. But in certain circles, in black communities across the South, in families who'd escaped Klan violence, in oral histories passed down through generations, the story persisted, not with names or dates, but with the essential truth that a plantation owner's daughter had turned against her father, that an enslaved man had fought back with more than his hands, that together they'd proven the powerful were vulnerable when the powerless learned to plan. The hooded figure became a folk hero, a symbol that appeared in stories, songs, and whispered warnings. Old folks in Georgia would tell their grandchildren about the night the Talbot plantation burned, metaphorically, if not literally, and how the Grand Master's own daughter had lit the match. Young people preparing to fight their own battles would invoke the story as proof that resistance was possible, that even systems built on terror could be brought down by people who were patient, careful, and willing to pay the price for freedom. In 1958, a historian researching Reconstruction-era Klan activity in Georgia came across the Talbot case in federal court records. She tracked down descendants, interviewed elderly residents of Meriwether County, and pieced together what had been carefully obscured. She learned about Lily and Josiah, about Rose and Webb and DeWitt, about the network that had turned one woman's fury and one man's survival into a weapon against organized hate. She tried to publish her findings. Several academic journals rejected the manuscript, uncomfortable with a narrative that framed extra-legal violence by oppressed people as anything other than tragic or criminal. One editor wrote, "The story as presented suggests that murder can be justified when legal systems fail to protect citizens. We cannot endorse this view, regardless of historical context." The historian stored the manuscript in a university archive, where it remained unread until 2013, when a graduate student discovered it while researching women's resistance during Reconstruction. The student digitized the manuscript, and it began circulating online in forums dedicated to hidden histories and untold stories of resistance. Today, if you visit Meriwether County, there's no historical marker for the Talbot plantation. The land was subdivided decades ago, and a subdivision called Oakmont Estates now sits where the main house once stood. No one remembers Horace, or Lily, or the night in 1876 when a father caught his daughter with a man he considered less than human. But in archives and oral histories, in digitized court records and self-published genealogies, the story lives on. And sometimes, late at night in Atlanta or Birmingham or Memphis, when Klan sympathizers gather to plan the same violence their grandfathers enacted, someone will mention the hooded figure, the one who knew all their secrets and made them afraid in their own strongholds. And the meeting will end early, just in case the legend is more than a story. Some ghosts won't stay buried. Some debts compound across generations. And some women, trained to be silent and obedient and pure, learn instead to be patient, strategic, and utterly unforgiving when they finally choose to speak. Subscribe if you want the next deep dive.